academics. I think it's always been a minority view inside academics. There's some reasons for this, which we may discuss. But I want to start with this idea that there are two traditions, and it's not just post-World War II. It goes way back to Ricardo and Mill and Thornton. The evolution of monetary economics needs to be understood as being driven in part by events in the world, by things that happened. People are trying economists are trying actually in their theorizing to talk about the world as it is, as it's changing. And academia responds to changes in the world with a lag. So these events are important for understanding why monetary economics evolved the way it did and why it will continue to evolve. So the first bullet point there is just to remind you that in the last century we've had two world wars, we've had a world depression. There was and particularly important, one of the consequences of these things was a much larger role of the state, of the government. The welfare state, the state taking responsibility for stabilization policy. These are new things in economic history, new in the long span of time, but 20th century things, not 19th century things. There's also the rise of the United States. A lot of my story is therefore going to be about economic thinking in the United States, because the shift of the center of economics from Cambridge, England to Cambridge, United States happened in this period. And it's part of the shift of the monetary system from having its center in London, organized around pound sterling, to having its center in New York, organized around the dollar. So I give you some dates there. 1913 was the founding of the central bank. The first central, well, not the first central bank, but a refounding of a central bank in the United States in 1913. It's always a surprise to non-Americans to realize that the United States didn't really have a functioning central bank until 1913. And then, of course, they had to figure out what they were going to do and learn their business. And so they were in no way ready to take over the operation of the global system after World War I, because it's a new central bank. And they never intended to. They wanted Britain to continue to run the world, as we'll see. So it wasn't until 1944 in Bretton Woods that the United States sort of stepped up to the plate and said, okay, it's going to be a dollar-based system, and that's what it's going to be. So there was two wars and a Great Depression in the middle as we're switching from sterling to the dollar. This is important for history of monetary economics. Another thing that happened in this period, and I think it's connected to the rise of the welfare state and stabilization policy, economists shift their audience from civil society, talking to people, explaining how the world works, training future businessmen, to talking to the state, being policy advisors, suggesting how you might run macroeconomic policy and so forth. And part of that was responsible for the so-called professionalization of economics. Became much more mathematical subject, the rise of econometrics, and formal modeling, computer modeling. Computers were invented and then used to create these big econometric models that were supposed to guide policy and help the governments to implement their new ambitious program of economic stabilization. I put these other, the last two bullet points there too, just to avoid focusing too much on the core of the system, because I think there are important things happening in the periphery too that wound up having effects and are having effects today. Decolonization, the rise, countries in the periphery claiming independence, trying to have their own monetary systems, run their own monetary policy and fiscal policy. Typically, these countries, Latin America's most famous example, have a long history of financial crises because they don't have very deep financial systems, and so they're growing, and there's a lot of experience with crisis there, and the rise of emerging markets later on, and I particularly want to emphasize the current thing. Financial globalization is basically a creature of the last maybe 20 years, but I think it is the essential fact of our day that we're now living in a global economy, not a bunch of national economies linked together loosely as it was in the end of World War II. It's now one economy, global economy, integrating all of the countries, and that's why, whereas it used to be that financial crises were local, in individual countries, okay, then they became regional, Asian financial crisis, okay. Now they're global. It's a global system. And so the crises in this system are also global. So the challenges of managing it are also larger. So this kind of review of the changing environment that people who are trying to understand the monetary system have to grapple with and have grappled with. I'm reminding you here that this is where we're going in this course, okay, is that I want to suggest to you a way to, in this second tradition, this Thornton-Milled credit tradition, a way of understanding monetary economics in the modern world that draws on some sources from the past, that we think of banking as a payment system. We think of it following Copeland, who invented flow of funds, as a money flow economy. Following Minsky, we put emphasis on the survival constraint, not the budget constraint. And that's a sort of American tradition. Copeland and Minsky are both Americans, come out of American institutionalist economics. The other tradition that I'm integrating in here is the British central banking tradition. So this is Hawtrey, emphasizing the hierarchy of money and credit, the inherent instability of money and credit. That is his phrase from his great book, The Art of Central Banking. John Hicks, this book that I just mentioned to you, 1989, that I love so much, The Market Theory of Money, emphasizing the centrality of the dealer function. And then going all the way back to Bagehot, lender of last resort, now reconfigured as dealer of last resort. This is where what we're going to be talking about more or less next time, tomorrow. But this lecture is meant to be a bridge from what you know to this, okay, what you maybe don't know yet. Here's what you do know, I think, as good students of economics. You have run into the quantity equation there, MV equals PT, the idea that the money supply times the velocity somehow affects the price level, and perhaps also the real economy, transactions, or income. Sometimes it's written MV equals PQ. ISLM, you've seen, I just mentioned that became the dominant way of understanding macroeconomics and an interpretation of Keynes' general theory, thinking of money as a store of value that people are holding as a financial asset. Another idea, purchasing power parity, the idea that the exchange rate between countries is really just the ratio of their price levels. So changes in the price level are the story about exchange rates. And the most modern kind of macroeconomics, which you may have learned, so-called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium theory, with a Taylor rule or inflation targeting as the central bank's policy. Not an LM curve, not a money supply equals money demand, but this idea of that interest rate is set to control the inflation, deviation of inflation from the target. These things you know. This is all, I will argue, in the Ricardian tradition. Okay, this first tradition that Hicks mentions. Okay, and in particular, I will develop the argument that and this is around this DSGE model, that what has happened over the post-war period with the rise of finance, that it is finance that has driven developments in macroeconomics, that both finance and macroeconomics are now organized around this single equation here. You may recognize this as an equation about intertemporal optimization for a household, which is where U is the utility function. So this is marginal utility of consumption in period T, and the expectation with a discount rate of the marginal utility of consumption in period T plus 1, and some kind of intertemporal return interest rate. In finance, this equation is turned into a theory of asset prices or yields or interest rates, and that would be called the consumption cap M. We're going to talk about that. In macroeconomics, this same equation is the core of the theory of business cycles, where we are thinking of consumption as following income. So this is about income fluctuations over time, and interest rates are something that you might be able to control by the central bank to stabilize business cycles. So there was this sort of convergence of macroeconomics and finance, at least at the level of theory, that I want to bring to your attention because it's important for understanding the evolution of monetary economics. But I need to develop this argument. This is just a preview of coming attractions. And also my way of looking around and seeing, have they seen this equation before? Do they know what this is about? And I think maybe you have. So I now know where I am with the audience. So now let me back up. I understand that the workshop this afternoon, there's going to be discussion of this little paper I wrote about the origins of the Fed and economic thinking at that time. I want to start there, okay? And the very last slide you'll see is about Minsky, and I understand the other paper for this afternoon is about Minsky. So I will be connecting those two papers already in this lecture today. But where we're going is to appreciate that this Ricardian tradition that has been orthodoxy does not have in it. It abstracts from all the things that are key in the money view. Remember I said that the money view has these two big ideas, banking as a payment system and banking as a market-making system, and these subordinate ideas, money flow, survival constraint. None of these things are in orthodox monetary economics. Instead of focusing on money flow, standard economics focuses on the national income and product accounts. It's not a flow of funds-based system. It's a NEPA-based system, the accounting structure. The survival constraint about settlement, which is key in the money view, is nowhere to be found in standard economics. It's all about budget constraint, in fact, intertemporal budget constraint that is driving things. There's no hierarchy. The money supply, money demand is just the n+1th market. There's a bunch of different commodities, and money is just one of them in standard. There's no dealers. Price is supposed to equilibrate supply and demand without the intervention of any dealers. We abstract from dealers. And there's no dealer of last resort. The central bank, this inflation targeting equation, if you look at how the DSGE model works, it operates through changing inflation expectations of people. They're not acting as a dealer of last resort or anything. They're acting as a sort of signal core to influence expectations about future inflation and change people's optimization. So there's I call these fatal abstractions because I think that there are reasons why modern economics didn't have much to say about the global financial crisis and is in need of some of the ideas from this alternative tradition. And that's what I'm trying to do in this course of lectures, is to suggest ways in which these alternative tradition that goes way back to Thornton and Mill can be brought into the more mainstream conversation, as it does every now and then. That's what Hicks was trying to do in 1967. That's what I'm trying to do now, 50 years later, 2017. And so there's always people like us saying, hey, there's this other people talking about this over there in banking. Maybe academics should pay attention to that a little bit. So that's I'm embarked on the same mission as Hicks, and it's good to have company of his caliber. So let's go back and let's start. In 1913, so this is when the central bank was founded in the United States, and there was a big argument at that time about whether we should have a central bank, whether we need a central bank, and what it should do. It was a big argument about that. We're going to hear more about that this afternoon. This is the only slide I'm going to use for that purpose, and I'll use it to connect the argument to the first slide about these two traditions in monetary economics to that debate that was going on in 1913. You can see here in the top row, let's see, there used to be a clicker here with a laser pointer, but never mind, I'll just point with my finger. You can see here, the top row here, this is the banking principle that emphasizes private credit money. So that's that second tradition that I was emphasizing. And the currency principle that builds its theory of money around the idea that money is essentially an outside asset, perhaps issued by the government or gold or something. And these were the varieties of monetary thought. On the vertical axis, there's the argument that you don't need to have any regulation, that the system is naturally regulated in some way. So you don't need a central bank, you can have decentralization. And on the right-hand side, some notion that you do need active management. And the main debate at the time was between Irving Fisher here for the quantity theory and J. Lawrence Laughlin for the real bills doctrine. And they were the titans. They were the big names that were fighting it out. Both of them agreed that the national banking system, which is what had preceded which was what was existing then, was causing all these crises. There had been a crisis about every 8 to 10 years in the United States. Many of them provoked by agricultural movements. It was a pretty agricultural country at the time. And these financial crises became global crises. They went to London simply because there was no central bank in the United States. And so every time there was a financial crisis, there was a call for gold from London, and so it disrupted global capital markets and money markets. And eventually Europeans got upset with the United States and says, why don't you grow up? Why don't you grow up and get yourself a central bank, okay? And so there was pressure on the United States from Europe to do that, but this was also indigenous. There was a commission created in 1910 after the financial crisis of 1907 to figure this out, and there were various proposals. Congress turned it down, tried another one. Eventually we got this central bank. As I say, the main debate was between these two axes. There's J. Lawrence Laughlin, who says, look, we don't really need a central bank. We just need the real bills doctrine. Self-liquidating commercial bills are adequate, and the system will regulate itself. H. Parker Willis is an important person for my figure because he was a professor at Columbia University, where I am from. He was in the business school there, and he was actually a teacher of Charlie Kindleberger and others who will appear later. Irving Fisher was at Yale, and he was a big quantity theory guy. Maybe you've seen some of his books. He's very famous in standard economics. This became the dominant academic economics following Irving Fisher. But in the upper right-hand corner I want to draw your attention to are some other names. Alan Young, who was a professor at Harvard. I wrote a biography of Alan Young. This is really where I got my start in monetary economics. As I said, I was looking for resources for building in the future. Paul Warburg is a European. He came from Europe to explain to us how to have a central bank. And Benjamin Strong was the first president of the New York Fed, which is the operational part. So these are people, what we actually got in the Fed, as I say, the argument was between these two traditions of money, okay? And what we got was something that both sides could claim was part of their plan, okay? But neither got everything they wanted, okay? What we actually got was the upper right-hand corner, okay? That was the Fed that was created, and the kind of banking system we got. So we got a system that was elastic, that was built around private credit money, but that was actively managed by the New York Fed and by the central bank in Washington. This debate is the debate that I want to bring to your attention because I will argue that the money view tradition is really in that upper right-hand corner, okay? And that has survived in central banking, practical banking world, even as academia, down in the lower right-hand corner, has gone a different direction. So that was the debate about economics and monetary theory. There's also, you need to understand America, it's a weird sort of country, that Americans are very suspicious of banking and money and Wall Street and all of that. And there's three bogeymen that are active in American imagination. One is big finance, Wall Street, suspicion of JP Morgan, that Wall Street is trying to, it's a Wall Street versus Main Street kind of manufacturing versus banking, and big suspicion of banking and a notion that they're up to no good. And that they were trying to create this central bank in order to enhance their own power. So we don't want to have a central bank because that's just a way of enhancing the power of Wall Street, and they have too much power already. Okay, that's one political concern in the background, and it's still there today in the United States. Believe me. Okay. Second one is a concern about big government, that we don't really want to have a central bank in the sense of a government bank, because that will give the government the ability to print money and do whatever it wants, and we've seen where that goes, that the government in fighting the Civil War printed all these greenbacks, caused all this inflation. We need to keep government on a tight leash, And so keep it away from banking because that would be a terrible, terrible thing. And definitely we don't want a central bank that's going to be the central bank of the world. I mean, that would be even worse. You know, the rest of the world, Americans are it's a big country, and so they can just ignore the rest of the world most of the time, and they don't, and they're suspicious of old Europe and so forth. So they were pleased that, in fact, the international monetary system was sterling based on gold. We didn't want to change that. The establishment of the Fed was not an attempt to replace the Bank of England, not at all. Okay, it's like, let them have that. Okay, we're scared of the big wide world, we're scared of big government, we're scared of big finance. And yet we got a central bank. It's kind of a miracle because a central bank is all three of these things, all three bogeymen all in once, you know. So how did what political magic made this possible? The political magic was the formulation in the in the act that created the Fed. The emphasis on real bills language, so that brought in the Laughlin people, okay, that what the central bank was about discounting bills, short-term credits that were issued by farmers, by manufacturers, by Main Street, okay, it's about Main Street. That we're definitely not going to be lending money to Wall Street. We're definitely not going to be lending money to the government. It says this, okay, in the Federal Reserve Act, okay, that the central bank is about supporting Main Street, not finance, not the government. Okay, so that gets rid of the first two bogeymen, right? We're not going to be connected to them. And there's going to be gold convertibility, so we're going to be connected to the world through the dollar being convertible to gold, but not any more than that. And we're going to create in Washington this democratic oversight, the Board of Governors, that is going to be appointed by the president, so there's going to be democratic oversight. It's not going to be a banker's operation. This is going to be part of government. Okay? This is how the Federal Reserve Act was set up. Now, this is the language. The reality was maybe something a little bit different. The language is emphasizing that the central bank is going to be discounting these short-term commercial credits. Okay? But in the United States, and other central banks have been created like that. The Bank of England was organized around short-term commercial credits, for example. But there was hardly any short-term commercial credits in the United States. The United States is an emerging market country, okay, at this time. They're building railroads, you know, it's long-term finance, it's bonds, it's not short-term trading bills. Almost all of the credit that's outstanding is mortgages and things like that. So this kind of self-liquidating bills, there just aren't very many of them around. You can't build a banking system around that. And the existing banking system was not. The banks held long-term mortgages as their assets and issued deposit accounts. Okay, they were proto-shadow banks in a way, so the kind of support they needed was not funding liquidity, but market liquidity, but the Act enabled providing funding liquidity. It pretended that the economy of the United States was organized around the circulation of real bills, but that wasn't really true. It was organized around long-term credit. Nobody noticed this contradiction, or rather Harold Moulton, who wrote some articles in 1918 about this, was pointing this out, that what is needed here is, he called it the shiftability doctrine, which we would recognize today as emphasizing market liquidity. That is to say that what banks need is to be able to take their bonds that they're holding or long-term loans that they're holding and use them as collateral at the central bank to shift them, maybe to sell them or to use them as collateral, not real bills that are automatically self-liquidating in 30 days or 90 days or whatever. He's arguing this in 1918, importantly, because this is before, as you will see, the Great Depression. There's an immediate transfer, so the language of the Federal Reserve Act and the reality of the U.S. system are in contradiction with each other. So that leads to this debate about monetary economics sort of continuing after the establishment of the Fed. And the war transformed things almost immediately. Remember, the Federal Reserve Act said, "Thou shalt not lend to the government." What is war finance? Lending to the government. Okay. The very first thing the Fed did was to help the U.S. Finance the war. It also said, "Thou shalt not lend to Wall Street." Okay. But who's making the market in Treasury bills? It's dealers and brokers in Wall Street, and so in supporting that debt, you wind up lending to Wall Street. Okay. So the first two rules, okay, they found, America's a legalistic country. They found ways around this, like, oh, we're not really lending to the government. We're just using it as collateral, or, but yes, they're lending to the government and they're lending to Wall Street. But it seemed okay because this is a great war and we're in favor of it. And so that overwhelmed the ideological opposition. And so immediately the Fed starts to transform itself. If you're interested in the history of the Fed, the very important document is the 10th Annual Report, 1923, which is written by Benjamin Strong, which is where he invents open market operations, or he's proposing that we should try to influence the monetary system through buying and selling of government debt. Buying and selling of government debt. Remember, the Fed is not supposed to buy and sell government debt. So he's saying we want to stabilize the economy, and you manipulating the interest rate, the discount rate, on short-term commercial bills is doing nothing because there aren't enough of those around. So let's manipulate the price of Treasury bills by buying and selling them. It's a very carefully worded document so that it is within the letter of the law, okay? But it's expanding the ambitions of the central bank to stabilize business cycles, to stabilize fluctuations. This is an important document. So the Fed was just getting its legs under it in 1923, and there's a boom in the 20s, real estate boom, building boom in the 20s. And there's an attempt to put back the international monetary system as it was before the war, organized around sterling, organized around gold standard, actually gold exchange standard. This all comes to an end. And depending on 1929, the stock markets crash. I would say that 1931 is more the point. This is when Britain goes off gold, and the banking system in the U.S. shuts down. And the reason for this is that the Federal Reserve acts as a lender of last resort, okay, but not as a dealer of last resort. It's willing to discount short-term commercial bills. It says, if you need liquidity, bring us short-term real bills and we will discount them. But the banks have nothing like this. They have mortgages. They have railroad bonds. They don't have the assets, so the central bank won't accept their collateral. And as a consequence, the banks shut their doors, and there's a banking crisis in the United States that spreads to the whole world, and we have an international depression. That the establishment of the Fed was not solid enough in order to support the US banking system, and the reestablishment of the international monetary system around sterling was never going to work because Britain was by then a fading power. And it needed to shift to the United States, but the United States couldn't even manage its own affairs, much less global affairs. During the Depression, some very important things happened. The passing of the Banking Act of 1935, of 1937, trying to learn the lessons of these crises and say, we will focus on market liquidity from now on. That's what we need to do. The bankers understood this, okay? The politicians did not understand this. The bankers understood this, and they said, we're going to do this from now on. And this conversation involves economists across the pond, too, in Britain. You see Keynes writing in 1930 in the treatise, I mentioned this yesterday, where he's focusing on the dealer function, mentioning emerging norms of management, focusing on the role of dealers in this system. Keynes is focusing in normal backwardation on the role of dealers in creating markets for commodities, for raw commodities. Hicks in Value and Capital extends this to thinking about forward markets for interest rates and for exchange rates, and thinking about liquidity preference as a bias in these markets, something that you might use as an indicator for monetary policy and as a location where you can try to influence the future of the economy. So there's a beginning of monetary thought beginning to engage with the fact that the world has collapsed, and it's collapsed because the Fed did the wrong thing. Okay, but all of this comes to a halt because there's another war, and so you focus on war finance again. And one of the consequences of World War II for our story, the most important consequences, is that now the U.S. is accepting the third bogeyman. Okay, we will be the center of the world economy. The Fed will be the global central bank. We're never going to say this out loud, okay, because the act says no, okay. But de facto, it became so, and that's in 1944. And it took a while after the war for us to move from war finance to peace finance. A key date there is 1951, when the Fed was let loose. It was allowed to let interest rates move. During the war, the Treasury had said, you have to keep interest rates low so that the borrowing costs for the war are low. And then after the war, the government said, and now we have to keep interest rates low because otherwise people who bought war bonds will take a capital loss, and that won't be good. So there was pressure to keep wartime conditions for quite a while. And it was only in 1951 that was relaxed. I mention this in particular because you'll see, just a little aside, one of the things that's happening in the world now, one of the ways of understanding the global financial crisis is that it was like a war. Okay, it was like war finance, and that what we're trying to do now globally is shift from war finance to peace finance. So this transition after World War II, from war finance to peace finance is analogous to what we're going through now, and it's going to be a while. It's not just about moving interest rates back to normal. It's about developing a whole new apparatus, banking apparatus. But we'll come back to that in later lecture. A key document here, which was a secret document for a long time, in 1952, was the report of the ad hoc subcommittee on the government securities markets. So this is a banker's document. Okay, it's saying what is the actual mechanics of the government securities market, the market makers, the dealers. What is the economics of that? That's how the Fed says in 1923. Okay, that's how it said in that 10th annual report, we're going to be trying to use the government bond market to stabilize the economy. How does the government bond market actually work? And so they went and they asked all the dealers, how does it work and what do you think about this? And they wrote this little report. And they emphasized that we can, there are two things that are important. One is the level of interest rates. You can change the level of interest rates, but also something they called the tone of the money market, okay? Which is referring to the liquidity of the dealers, their willingness to absorb, and their ability, because of their ability to get credit, to absorb fluctuations in supply and demand on their own balance sheets. This document was secret. Okay. And it was secret, why? For political reasons, right? If it was known that the New York Fed was sitting down at the table with broker and dealers from Wall Street and saying, what do you want? You know, how do you work? Let me understand your problem, okay? This would have been, terrible optics. But this report is important for understanding that there is this banking tradition that is influencing the way central bankers are thinking. They're just not allowed to show it in public. Eventually, this was discovered and it was published in the Congressional Record. It was a big scandal. It's actually an extremely interesting report, and I assign it to students. You can learn a lot about the monetary system by reading this report. It's just a shame that that all of the textbooks didn't know anything about this. It was secret. So they built all of monetary economics on completely other basis. They didn't realize that the central bank was thinking in a different way, okay, because it was secret. Okay. The second tradition of monetary theory was a secret. Only the first tradition was public. And this is because of this peculiar American political economy where we have to pretend that banks are not important and are not influential because we're scared of them. So there's emerging norms of management. The way that the Fed was thinking in 1952 about how the world would work is that they're going to control short-term interest rates, that's the rate target there, and that dealers, okay, are going to transmit that short-term interest rate into prices of all these other assets. So these little arrows, okay, are about transmitting the short-term rate into a treasury bill rate, into treasury bond rate, long-term rates. about transmitting the rate in government securities into capital markets, into short-term repo rates, into commercial paper rates, into corporate bond rates, and into banks, into the Fed funds rate, commercial and industrial lending rate, mortgage lending rate. So, but at every one of these transmission points, there's a private sector, a dealer of some kind, that is doing arbitrage between something and something else. Okay, so that the central bank is thinking that it is involved in this market, in this condition of market makers of various kinds, and it's engaging with them to try to influence the world as a whole. Remember, stabilization policy has a lot to do with, well, we want to influence investment spending, okay, and so that means the price of corporate bonds, okay, or we want to influence housing spending, real estate. That's about mortgage lending. So the rates that are influencing macroeconomic things are actually rather far from where the Fed is. The Fed is right there, the overnight interest rate. And the transmission of that overnight interest rate into a long rate that influences macroeconomic things all comes through the dealer system, through private markets. It's not directly controlled, and that was the idea, that we're not going to directly control that. We did directly control those rates during the war. Long-term rates were set by the Fed. And there was credit rationing in order to make sure that the credit went to the government preferentially. Moving to peacetime finance was about setting up this system of private dealer finance. And internationally, this is again after World War II, the dollar was the domestic dollar was a key currency, and it was going to be related to other currencies through dealer markets. Initially, these were controlled by central banks, but moving toward foreign exchange markets. This was less worked out in 1952 because there were still a lot of restrictions in capital flows. But this was in the offing also. I put this here so that when we come to global money later on, we can see the emerging hierarchy. That's what this is about, with the dollar at the top of the hierarchy, and sort of three-sector world: Asia, Europe, and the United States, and everyone else kind of underneath in the hierarchy. So there's this beginning thinking of practical bankers about putting the monetary system back together again after World War II. But it was all secret. Central bankers all talk with each other, and they're not, for the record, not to journalists, not to academics. So the academics went their own way. So now I'm shifting gears. What happened in academia during this period? You will have heard a story about the evolution of macroeconomics, probably. This is a story that economists tell themselves, okay? That where did macroeconomics come from? Well, it came from Keynes in the general theory, and it was brought to the United States by Alvin Hansen, who taught at Harvard, who was an American institutionalist, a sort of student of Burns and Mitchell, and a business cycle theorist. So in his hands, it got what Keynes wrote in the UK got converted into kind of a theory of business cycles and business cycle stabilization. And a student of Hansen's at Harvard, the next generation, was James Tobin, and Samuelson and others created this neoclassical synthesis, which was a blend of Irving Fisher, intertemporal Walrasian equilibrium, and the Cambridge quantity equation. So there was a bunch of origins of macroeconomics, and it was a bit of a hodgepodge. It was a policy science after the war. And this evolved over time because it was this mishmash of various things. Eventually, academics, being academics, point out, this little bit is not actually consistent with that little bit, and so we have to decide which one we want. And in the course of all of that, what happened was that they got rid of all the inconsistencies, and what resulted was not Keynesian theory at all, but new classical theory. And I'm mentioning Lucas as a particular Nobel Prize winner who was a key actor there, and real business cycle theory following beyond that in 1982 and 1983, which eliminated money from the picture entirely. And it was about investment shocks and preference shocks and so forth. Probably you've learned some of this, and you've heard this story that there's this evolution of macroeconomics from Keynesian to New Classical, and then New Keynesian reacted to that, and so forth. I'm not saying that story, all those things happened, okay? So it's not that story is not true, but you see I'm putting a question mark there because I want to emphasize another piece of this, okay? I want to emphasize that the core problem in macroeconomics was not so much that it was a mishmash of lots of things, but that it had a monetary theory that didn't really work, okay? And it couldn't really work once you're starting with this Ricardian tradition. And so eventually they just abandoned it. And what happened was that macroeconomics was replaced by finance. Okay? That finance is the key actor here. This is a quote from Lucas 1975, where he's just getting started, where you can sort of see him laying out the forces at play, okay, in 1975. This is a long quote, but I think it's worth reading it. You've heard of Lucas, I think, yes? Okay. He's made it to Poland. He's a Nobel Prize winner. So he says, on the one hand, it is easy to postulate agents and market institutions which ignore or foolishly waste information. The result is a theory which seriously understates agents' abilities to vary their decision rules with changes in the environment, such as, for example, the theory underlying the major econometric forecasting models. What's he talking about there? He's talking about Keynesian economics. He's talking about the Keynesian orthodoxy that he is opposing. He's saying easy to postulate agents that waste or ignore, so it's saying this is not a very good theory. It looks, and that's the theory that's underlying the large econometric models that the Fed is using to guide monetary policy, to guide fiscal policy. All of modern policy is driven by this sort of thing. We don't want that. That's old stuff. That's no good. Okay. Then he says, it is equally easy to postulate efficient securities markets which rapidly transmit all information to all traders. The result is a static general equilibrium model. To observe that one must avoid both extremes to understand the business cycle does not take one very far in discovering the correct centrist model, but it seems nonetheless an essential point of departure. What is he talking about, which I put in red there? He's talking about finance. Okay, the efficient securities markets. He's talking about the rise of modern finance, and in particular, the idea of efficient securities markets from Fama and others. This is the period when the capital asset pricing model has just been invented. This is the period when options pricing, Fisher-Black has solved the option pricing model. So I'm going to go through some of this in detail. So he is pointing out here, which I think historians have missed, that it's finance, okay, that is the alternative to Keynesian economics. That's putting pressure on the evolution of macroeconomics. It's finance that is guiding the leaders of the new classical revolution. They're moving in the direction of finance. So we need to think about finance as a prime mover, not about the internal contradictions of old Keynesianism, but about how finance worked. That's why my second book was a biography of Fisher-Black, which maybe some of you have seen, is about the rise of modern finance and its influence on macroeconomics. But I don't think this thing happened with Lucas. It didn't start with Lucas. It started before that. And I want to draw your attention to a particular actor, Jacob Marshak, who is probably not known to any of you, who is, I think, an important figure in understanding the evolution of monetary economics. In 1934, he wrote a little paper proposing how we should do monetary economics and macroeconomics. And these are the equations in that paper. I don't know if you can read them. You can see the top one. Let me just explain. These are his exact equations. So he's saying that the quantity of every good is a sigma, which is for supply, okay? S for supply, which is a function of prices and wages. equals demand, delta for demand, which is the price of the various goods and so forth. So this is a series of supply and demand curves for all the different goods. I equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so this is Walrasian general equilibrium that he has in mind here. It's a series of simultaneous equations that are solving for the price vector. You've probably seen this in general equilibrium, how this works. Then the second equation, you can recognize that's MV equals PT. That's the quantity theory. So this is where the price level is supposed to come from. It's supposed to come from the money supply. And then the third one is just what do we mean by price level? The price level is an index that is somehow combining all the prices of the individual goods. Okay. So this is the model that he has in mind for macroeconomics, that it is Walrasian general equilibrium, like Irving Fisher, okay, with a quantity theory pasted on. Okay, that's the idea in 1934. 4 years later, he updates this a little bit, okay, and he updates it by suggesting that in a very, very important paper called Money and a Theory of Assets, in which he suggests that we could think of money mainly as a financial asset and think of it as a portfolio decision. So not MV equals PT, but money supply equals money demand. Okay, but where does money demand come from? It comes from comparing the marginal utility of one asset and the marginal utility of another asset. That's what this equation is. So you can see this is the relative prices of two different assets, P over Q. Okay, and this is the marginal utility of the first moment, the second moment. So this is mean variance analysis of this is before the capital asset pricing model, okay? But it's the basic idea of the capital asset pricing model, that you think of every asset as having a mean and a variance, and think of people as having desire for higher return and desire for lower variance. And so they're comparing different assets and they're allocating their portfolio among them. So the origin of modern finance, arguably, is this paper in 1938. 1938, before the war. Okay, this is during the Depression, at a time when all financial markets are closed down. You know, this is just theory. This is somebody figuring out. And Jacob Marshak is very much a social democrat, very much interested in New Dealer, trying to help help governments run the economy and make it work better. He had his main influence through his students. That's why you've never heard of him, but you have heard of his students. He taught at the New School, a young Italian who fled from Italy during World War II because he was Jewish. And he wrote his dissertation under Marshak, Liquidity, Preference, and the Theory of Money. Franco Modigliani, you know him, he got a Nobel Prize, okay? And this is the equation, this is the picture in his thesis. This is ISLM. So he wrote his doctoral dissertation, and this became the core of post-war macroeconomics. This is where ISLM came from. It came from this idea of monetary Walrasianism, as I call it, that was proposed by Marshak, his teacher, and was also endorsed by Paul Samuelson. In 1947, Paul Samuelson published a revised version of his dissertation. He wrote his dissertation in 1937 at MIT. I'm sorry, not at MIT, at Harvard, and then he moved to MIT where he taught the foundations of economics. And he tells you in that, if you look at the monetary sections of that book, that he was very much influenced by a 1922 book by Robertson, Cambridge economist, called Money. And he's proposing what I call monetary Walrasianism, that we think of the supply and demand for money. He cites Hicks, 1935, this suggestion for simplifying monetary theory, and he cites Marshak, that Money and the Theory of Interest Rates. And he uses this equation, money supply equals money demand, that equation in that 1947. He very explicitly rejects what Keynes proposes in the general theory, that there should be a monetary theory of the rate of interest. No, the rate of interest is a real variable. It comes from productivity, according to Samuelson. He also rejects a liquidity preference theory of the term structure. He says, no, that's not right either. That's not consistent with Walrasian theory. These things are the things that were being developed by Keynes and Hicks in the late 30s. This normal backwardation, all that stuff is an attempt to create a monetary theory of the rate of interest. And Samuelson says, no, we're not going to do that. Okay, we're going to have neoclassical synthesis instead. It's going to be monetary Walrasianism with sticky wages and imperfections of various kinds. And so this is where post-war orthodoxy gets started. These dates here, 1955 and 67, these are the dates of Paul Samuelson's textbook, okay, that he published, that everyone learned from. Okay, so this is where academics got started. They got started through the influence of a very few people, okay? And this is possible because in wartime, academia stopped reproducing itself. You know, everyone who was any good went to government and started to help fight the war, and they never came back, okay? And so it was all hollowed out, and so very few people could control the agenda right after the war. And I'm not saying they were bad people, but they had views on monetary economics that they then imparted to their students, and nobody looked back to say, well, what was happening before World War II? What were the other ideas that were, nobody looked back. It seemed like another world. You know, we're starting here. We're going to be Keynesians. We're going to manage the business cycle. And we're going to be scientists, and we're going to do math. And it's going to be a brave new world. It's this that Hicks wound up saying, that was all a mistake. You know, that first quote, okay, he's thinking, and he repudiates his interpretation of Keynes in his 1937. He says, no, that doesn't really explain what Keynes is about, okay. He doesn't repudiate his early monetary theory, his simplifying view, but he says everyone else has misunderstood it, and he is proposing a different thing. I won't go into this very much because this isn't a lecture on Hicks, but just to say how Hicks became, he found the money view, or he developed the money view himself as a sort of mea culpa for his error in shunting economics on the wrong path as he came to see it, and tried to fix this in his subsequent work. That's just an aside. He had no influence whatsoever, I would say, on mainstream economics. He was a voice in the wilderness. Nobody was listening to him. They were all moving in a different direction, and this is the direction they were moving in. This became orthodoxy. So here's a picture from Tobin's famous 1969 article on general equilibrium theory of money, and showing, and this is a sort of schematic for building an econometric model, right? Saying how the different sectors of the econometric model are going to interact with each other. How is it that monetary policy here influences asset prices, which then influence other things? And so this is the building out of monetary Walrasianism. And the right-hand diagram here is Modigliani's diagram. He was in charge of developing the monetary sector of the big econometric model that was developed by the Fed, MIT, and Penn, the FMP model, so-called. And if you look at that, you can't see it because it's too small, but over here on the left, it's money markets. And so here's the Fed influencing the rate of interest and so forth. That's all supposed to affect financial markets, which affects goods markets and total output and so forth. So this sort of plate of spaghetti here is the schematic for these large econometric models. It's this that Lucas is critiquing in 1975. Okay, he's saying this is just a mess. Okay, and it's not good economics, and we need something better. But this was the emerging norms of monetary management in the heyday of Keynesian orthodoxy in the 60s and 70s. And these are the leaders. Very different norms of management from the kind that were emerging in the 30s that then got stopped because of the war and because the banking view went underground in America. So here's the state of debate circa 1975. Franco Modigliani is the voice of the dominant Keynesian strain. And I'm showing you this is the same 2x2 diagram that I started with in 1913, okay, but with different names, okay? That instead of Irving Fisher, down here, we have Franco Modigliani. And I put him in red because he is the dominant figure at the time. Instead of Lawrence Laughlin up here, we have Fisher Black, who is just invented options pricing, but he's also interested in macroeconomics, and he wrote some very famous papers there about how we didn't need central banks and things. So it's a very laissez-faire kind of view, and he is the titan of finance. So finance is taking over the role of the real bills doctrine folks over there. And upper right-hand corner are the people I love, okay, who are blending these two. Charlie Kinderberger. All three of these people are at MIT at the very same time. And I've put their dates when they arrived there. Franco Modigliani, Charlie Kinderberger came in 1948. He was first. Franco Modigliani, 62. Fisher Black was brought from Chicago in 1975. And so there is this debate between monetary theories, okay, all happening in one building, okay, in MIT, the department that Paul Samuelson built, you could call it. But it was very clear who was the winner of that debate, who had Samuelson support, and it was Modigliani. It was Modigliani. So the same debate that was happening in 1913 is still happening in 1975. And in academia, the lower right-hand corner wins, okay? In the real world, other points of view win, and in fact, the finance becomes a dominant point of view, and even a dominant point of view begins to be in economics, as we're going to see. And the reason is because this famous paper that I mentioned, 1969, by Tobin, I showed you his schematic of econometric modeling. He said, if the interest rate on money, as well as the rates on all other financial assets, were flexible and endogenous, then there would be no room for monetary policy to affect aggregate demand. He's talking about the properties of the Arrow-de-Breuil general equilibrium model. He's saying that it's only stickiness. It's stickiness of prices that gives the monetary authority a lever to push on, okay? Because you can change nominal prices, and when you change nominal prices, you're changing real prices because of stickiness of other prices. If these were flexible, there would be no leverage. That's how the model works. That's how his model works. What happened since 1969? What happened since 1969 is deregulation of finance. All these prices become more and more flexible. Okay? So the theory that they're working with is a theory that says as these prices become more and more flexible, we lose all our ability to control anything. Okay? So this is I don't think this is actually true, okay, as we'll see, okay, but they thought it was true. And all academics was built on this. So this is where the new classical traction came from, because the Keynesian orthodoxy had a theory that said if all financial prices start to get flexible, we're going to lose our leverage over the economy. This is Frank Hahn saying sort of a similar thing. One could see why the monetarist tide was so successful. No one had thought of building any dikes against this tide. This is in a festschrift for Paul Samuelson. Okay, so he's saying the weak point of the Keynesian orthodoxy was in fact the monetary side. He had earlier written in 1965, when he was a young man, about the problems that monetary theory doesn't fit into general equilibrium at all. The consequence of all of this is that modern macroeconomics, and I'm showing you Mike Woodford, my colleague, his great book, Interest in Prices, just said, well, monetary economics doesn't fit into general equilibrium. Let's just dispense with monetary economics. And so there are no banks in interest in prices. There's no money supply. There's no money demand. There's just a Taylor rule and inflation targeting. That's why we got Taylor rule and inflation targeting, because there was no adequate monetary theory to support Keynesian economics, which the leaders of the field all realized. They didn't really say it too loudly because that's disturbing. Okay, and they were working on trying to fix this, but they did not manage to fix it, and so that's why we got the macroeconomics we have. What we have instead so macroeconomics lost its ascendancy. As I say, in '75, it was already being threatened by the monetarist counterinsurgency. But what I want to emphasize is not the rise of monetarism, but the rise of finance. It's not Milton Friedman, okay, I think, who's the key figure here, but the people after him, the rise of modern finance. Because this is a shift in conception of time. Showing you here the way what I call the economics view. Ever since Adam Smith, economists have had this kind of mental image of the world, that the past determines the present, that it's the past investments of our grandfathers building railroads and houses and the capital stock and intellectual stock and all of that, that is our inheritance, and that we have to build on ourselves with our own investments and gradually move forward. And income is, the flow of income is just a function of this accumulated capital and the current effort, capital and labor. So the past determines the present. The income flow comes from the investments of the past. Finance takes exactly the opposite point of view. They say finance has the view that the future determines the present, okay? That it's imagination about what the future income is going to be like that determines capital values. So that's what that equation is, that the price of a capital asset is the expectation of future cash flows discounted back to the present. The future. The fact that it costs a lot to build this thing or it didn't cost a lot to build this thing, none of that is relevant. What matters is your projection of future cash flows back to the present. These 2 points of view flipped in about 1975, okay? From this being dominant to this being dominant, from economics to finance. And the people who flipped it are these people. Building also on Marshak. Capital asset pricing model, Markowitz, maybe you know some of these names. Sharpe, these are Nobel Prize winners, but there was another version of the capital asset pricing model created by a man named Jack Traynor, who was a practitioner, building on Modigliani-Miller theorem. Option prices also, I mentioned Fisher-Black, Black-Scholes, 1973. And there are a couple of origins of these things. These ideas transformed macroeconomics as well. It is finance that was the inspiration of real business cycle theory, okay? Not Milton Friedman, not the quantity theory. And it was finance that led to the development of the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. No banks, no money, liquidity is a free good, and prices formed by the expectations of the future, just like finance. Expectations brought back to the present, okay? This is where modern macroeconomics came from. But modern finance has no better theory of money than does modern economics, okay? Here's just a little bit more information about the connection between modern finance and modern macroeconomics. I pointed out to you in a very, very early slide this first equation, the intertemporal Euler equation there for maximization of consumption. And I said how finance treats this as a theory of asset prices. So now I'm rewriting this as this is the intertemporal rate of substitution as M, so this is the margin utilities over each other, comparing two returns on two different assets. So it's a theory of portfolio choice under finance. Macroeconomics writes it as this, as a sort of IS curve, where the consumption at two different times, it's here, these are the two different times, and this is the marginal rate of substitution here, and here's the interest rate minus expected inflation. So that's a nominal interest rate minus expected inflation makes the real interest rate. So it's this, IT, this is the leverage that the central bank has. By controlling IT, they're controlling business cycles. So I said that verbally, half an hour ago, 45 minutes ago. These are the actual equations. They look different from each other, so most people haven't recognized that they have the same origin. They're both evolving from this intertemporal Euler equation. That finance and modern macroeconomics are intertwined in that way. Instead of a theory of money, what we have is, in standard economics, are special theories of liquidity. You might have learned some of these, okay? So there's this article in 1983 by Diamond and Dybvig Bank runs, deposit insurance, and liquidity. There's another one by Holmstrom and Tirole, 1998. After the financial crisis, this book was published, Liquidity and Crises, that is just a collection of all kinds of articles that were written in the last 20 years to say, oh, economists do know something about liquidity and crises, but every single one of them, okay, is building on either Diamond and Dybvig or Holmstrom and Tirole. So that's it. That's what economics has to say about liquidity, and it's a special theory. It's not integrated with macroeconomics. There are special theories of banks on the side, and in a way that can't be integrated with modern macroeconomics, although there are attempts. What I'm going to propose, basically starting now and continuing next time, is that we should think about, and as an alternative, reviving this money view that Hicks was trying to revive, that Thornton and Mill were doing, that came from Hawtrey, that Keynes himself was involved in, as an explicit point of view. And this involves a shift in our understanding of time again. Whereas finance is thinking that the future determines the present, our ideas about the future determines the present. The money view is the idea that the present determines the present. Okay? That it's cash flow and cash commitments today meeting and the settlement constraint that determines what's what. This is a repeat of that. And these are the last two slides. I'm going to be following Hyman Minsky, who in 1967, this is my favorite quote of Hyman Minsky, said, "Capitalism is essentially a financial system." Essentially a financial system. This is a very different view than most economists have. And in my little biography of Minsky, that I was asked to write this after he died, I am describing his worldview. Okay, and this worldview is the worldview that I got interested in 1999. That was sort of where I began this journey to try to think, well, Minsky grew up and he was talking about the world in the 60s and the 70s. He never knew about modern finance. He never understood very much about that. So somebody younger than him needs to take the ball farther, and let me just build on him. But first I have to understand what he has to say. And this is what he had to say. So this is where I started in 1999. So I'll just read this. This is even longer, but and I'll talk you through it, and that'll be the last. By his own reckoning, Minsky was an institutionalist economist. This is an American tradition, in the sense that he viewed the structure of the economic world not as immanent in some set of underlying data, such as endowments, technology, and preferences. Okay, that's standard economics, right? Endowments, technology, preferences, that's how it all starts. And he's saying, no, okay, that's not where you start. But rather as constituted by a set of key economic institutions. He was institutionalist too in his insistence that our economy is essentially, not incidentally, monetary in character. Money is not a veil, okay? His way of fleshing out that idea was to look at every economic unit, firms, households, governments, even countries, as though it were a bank, daily balancing cash inflow against cash outflow. From that point of view, the categories that most economists and most people take to be solid simply melt into air. Production, consumption, and trade are nothing more than flows of money in and out and between different economic units. The most real thing is money, but money is nothing more than a form of debt, which is to say a commitment to pay money at some future time in the future. The whole system is fundamentally circular and self-referential, nothing underneath, as it were, holding it up. In Minsky's hyper-modern institutionalism, institutions do not merely organize the stuff of some pre-existing real world, they are the only real world there is. Financial relationships are not about mediating something else in the real side of the economy. They are the constitutive relationships of the whole system. The veil of money is the very fabric of the modern economy. It's this point of view, okay, that I wish to turn into theory. This starting point as a way of thinking about the world that we're living in today. And that's it. Thank you. Now it's almost exactly 11:30, so if you have time for questions, I'm happy to take questions. It's up to Piotr here. Yes?
Hello. During the lecture, you said that when the Keynesianism had his best day, let's say, that monetary economics was not so in favor of among central bankers. Is it possible that nowadays we can see any signs of monetary economics going back into favors among central bankers? For example, in the Fed or the ECB?
In recent years, it is certainly the case that central banks have hired a lot of economists. They've hired a lot of people who are experts in the DSGE models and so forth. They tend to put them in a separate little area they call research, okay, and keep them away from policymaking. The actual policy world is much more influenced by kind of inchoate versions of money view thinking. If you look at the publications of the BIS, for example, this is explicitly critical of DSGE. It doesn't like it much at all. So what is happening these days is that this debate between traditions of monetary theory is happening inside central banks, between divisions. The operational division and the research division typically is happening. And I think it's beginning to happen to somewhat inside academia as well. But central banks are where the intellectual conversation is at this moment because they have to understand the real world. That's their job. The notion that that credit is inherently unstable, that's why they exist, central bankers. They can't abstract from the instability. Okay, so there is debate inside central banks very much about what part of academic economics is useful and what part is not. There are very strong views on this. If you read some of the things that Andy Haldane writes for the Bank of England or others, it's a very interesting debate. I find myself often talking in the central banking seminars much more than in academic seminars. That's where the actual monetary debate is happening right now. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question.
I have an additional one, if the organizer allows, but it's very short. Based on what you said, I want to ask a further question. If this trend goes on so strong that maybe monetary economics can also prevail to policy making, for example, replacing the Taylor rule, which is very present among policymakers.
Yes, I think that one of the consequences of the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, is the Taylor rule is dead. That's the past. Okay, we're holding on to it just because we don't know what else to do, But I think it's not the future; it's the past. Yes, and other of these ideas on my first slides as well. As I mentioned yesterday, when a retiring central banker, Dan Tarullo, can say we have no good theories of inflation. We central bankers have no good theories of inflation. That is an invitation. That's an intellectual opening, right? It's saying, help us. Let's think outside the box because inside the box is not helping us.